Every virus tells a story. In October 1989, a deadly invader landed in an American suburb, marking the start of a terrifying new chapter in the story of Ebola.
We had never been faced with this kind of a situation before.
Didn't know how it was transmitted, didn't know where it lived, didn't know just how easy it was to get, except that there wasn't any treatment for it. It's so dangerous, and it was so mysterious, and it was in greater Washington, D.C. What happened at Reston changed our world.
But what happened after Reston shook the whole world. In 2014, the largest Ebola outbreak in history burned through West Africa.
I had responded to hurricanes, earthquakes, war, famine, but I'd never seen anything quite like Ebola.
One mistake was all it took to become infected.
Now, Ebola is back.
Just behind me is the Ebola Treatment Center here in Butembo, which is the epicenter of the epidemic.
Stopping it in its tracks is more urgent than ever.
What would we do if it rapidly grew to 100,000 cases, to 1 million cases, to 1 billion cases? How do you contain that?
First, we have to stop history from repeating itself.
The international response to the disease has been a failure.
It's over there. Don't let it get here.
This isn't just a story about a virus. This is about us.
We let this happen. The world let this happen.
In 1976, a deadly illness erupted in a remote province of Zaire. Belgian nuns tending to the sick described horrific symptoms, followed by agonizing deaths.
It attacks tissue around the body, basically attacks everything in the human body except for your bones.
Doctors from Zaire, Europe, and America traveled to the epicenter to investigate.
When responders got there, they had no idea what they were looking at, but they did know that they were looking at this deadly new virus.
The researchers might not have known what this new virus was, but they learned how it spread so quickly. Medical supplies were so scarce here that the Belgian nurses had resorted to reusing hypodermic needles. This virus had an astounding mortality rate of nearly 90%. In less than 2 months, it claimed some 300 lives. Then suddenly the nightmare ended, and no one knew why.
They just knew the virus popped out of nowhere and it disappeared just as quickly.
Epidemiologists named it Ebola Zaire after the nearby Ebola River and dreaded its return, which it did. In just a few relatively contained outbreaks over the next decade. But the greatest fear was that someday the virus would emerge in a densely populated region, which it also did.
So back in 1989, in the Washington suburb of Reston, all of a sudden, a bunch of monkeys at a warehouse started dying.
Hazelton Laboratories, Reston, Virginia, one of the largest animal testing companies in the country. A shipment of 100 long-tailed macaques came in from the Philippines. 2 were dead on arrival. The illness quickly spread to dozens of monkeys. Desperate for a diagnosis, the company sent samples to a high-security lab run by the military. The U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, or USAMRIID. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Jacks examined the tissues.
What we found then was really pretty alarming. I was seeing a section of liver. I saw all these very large cells, which are called macrophages, and they were full of material, which is very typical in a filovirus infection.
A filovirus, a tiny spaghetti-like strand that replicates at lightning speed and causes devastating diseases. Dr. Jacks was very familiar with them. She worked behind layers of bomb-resistant walls where the Army stored an archive of frozen killers. Marburg, Ebola Sudan, and the most lethal of all, Ebola Zaire. Dr. Jacks used her stash of filoviruses to compare to the monkey sample, and to her surprise, The one that matched was the virus that struck Zaire in 1976.
We're thinking, well, that's not possible. We need to check it again. And they checked it 3 times, and every time there was no mix-up. It was showing positive for Ebola Zaire.
I think Nancy came to my office and said,
I did come to his office.
"You're not going to believe what just happened. You know, it looks like we've got Ebola virus in these monkeys in Virginia." There was a lot of confusion and going, "Oh, wow, this is really crazy. What are we going to do?"
We immediately had to kick into high gear.
The Army formed a battle plan. First order, euthanize the monkeys to prevent an epidemic. Nancy's husband, Colonel Jerry Jacks, led the team.
Nobody likes killing monkeys, but we were in an emergency situation. It was something that we had to do to make sure that we didn't have a significant outbreak within the human population.
After Jerry's team completed his grueling mission, Nancy's team thoroughly examined the tissues. On a cellular level, the virus looked almost identical to Ebola Zaire, yet it wasn't behaving like it.
Never been reported in non-human primates before. No humans had gotten sick yet. We're all going, well, what's really happening? It's clearly Ebola, but we don't know. Is it a new strain? Your brain goes into diagnostic brain lock because the pieces, as you know them, the puzzle is just not fitting together.
Then, one more puzzle piece. 4 animal handlers tested positive for Ebola, but amazingly, none of them got sick. Scientists confirmed this was a new strain and named it Ebola restin.
We all have viruses within us that are either good for us, some are bad for us, and some don't have any effect at all. The restin virus didn't do anything to humans.
The Army knew they dodged a bullet and immediately got to work on preempting the next outbreak by gaming out the worst-case scenarios.
The question, of course, is are you going to get a mutation that then makes it more airborne or makes it more contagious?
What we did in a contained building was pretty dramatic, but imagine if it was a city.
The nightmare scenario for global public health officials is something that combines the transmissibility of something like the Spanish flu, which infected probably about 1 billion people a century ago, and the mortality of Ebola, which kills as many as 9 out of every 10 people that get it. If something like that spreads around the world, we're just not ready to fight it.
When Ebola isn't killing, it's hiding.
The Ebola virus lives in some kind of reservoir host. We're not 100% certain what it is, but it's probably a bat. And the virus itself doesn't do anything to that bat.
A virus's job is simple, to make itself immortal. Killing its host can put a damper on that plan. But every now and then, it leaps over into a life form it can destroy. Scientists call this spillover.
Spillover is this idea that viruses basically jump between species.
Close contact with infected animals is an invitation for a virus to jump to us, whether we're living near them or making a meal of them.
First time it jumps, can't get a foothold. Second time it jumps, oh, it's learned a little bit more about your immune system.
Influenza is fundamentally a disease of birds that somewhere way back in evolution jumped species and came to humans.
We get flus from birds or swine. That's why we call them bird flus and swine flus. And these zoonotic events happen all the time.
But they're happening with more frequency because the world is moving faster.
A virus that breaks out in Kinshasa today can be in London tomorrow and New York on Tuesday.
So we are more connected than we think. We are more connected than we believe.
Transportation is one of the predominant determining forces about the spread of something that a century or so ago would have been a blip.
In December of 2013, a spillover occurred in a small village in Guinea, a remote region that borders on 2 other West African countries, Liberia and Sierra Leone. It was the beginning of what would become the worst Ebola epidemic in history.
A 2-year-old boy was playing near his house in a tiny little village. There are only 31 homes in this village called Meliandu. In the local language, it means this is as far as we go. He was playing near a tree, and that tree was home to a bat colony. We don't know exactly what happened, whether a bat bit him, whether he touched some guano and then touched his eye, but at some point, a small strand of the Ebola virus got into his bloodstream. It replicated quickly. He died within just a week or so. His mother was the second victim. His sister was the third victim.
From Meliandu, the illness spread quickly throughout the region. Guinean health officials warned of a hemorrhagic fever, which strikes like lightning. With a sudden increase in deaths came scores of funerals. More funerals meant more exposure.
When somebody dies, that is the moment at which their body is most likely to infect somebody else.
In West Africa, we like to wash the body of the dead, kiss the body of the dead, and that's how the disease spreads.
You had a burial ceremony where 50 people came into contact with a corpse. Suddenly, that's 50 people who could get Ebola from that one case. That risk enabled it to really skyrocket.
In just a couple of months, the disease had spread across the border to Liberia and Sierra Leone. But the identity of the virus went undetected.
The problem with Ebola is that it really, really resembles a lot of tropical diseases.
Malaria, cholera, typhoid.
And then when those tests came back negative, you still thought maybe Lassa fever.
By the way, nobody was testing for Ebola in West Africa because Ebola didn't exist in West Africa.
By the time doctors recognized the virus, it was well on its way to the crowded cities.
December, January, February, March, then all of a sudden it became clear that, whoa, we really have a problem.
I think nothing could have prepared us for how bad things were.
By the time the rest of the world became aware, the fuse had been lit, and the viral bomb was about to explode.
I'm scared for me your life. I don't want to die now.
The Sabeti Lab, Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is where cutting-edge detective work is conducted on the tiniest life forms. The principal sleuth, Dr. Pardis Sabeti.
We investigate the genomes of viruses and other microbes by looking at the patterns of these letters that make up their genome.
Sabeti's field research often takes her to Kenema, Sierra Leone, where her team studies Lassa fever, a hemorrhagic virus related to Ebola, but not as lethal. By May 2014, Ebola was spilling out of Guinea and across borders. Kenema was the only clinic equipped to care for Ebola patients in all of Sierra Leone. The team was confident they could handle it and prepared for the first patient to walk through the door.
But it didn't come in as a single case. It came in as a tidal wave. By the time we saw the first case in Kenema, it had been breeding for months, and quickly the one case changed from 31 to 92 to 147. We could just see this was something different than anything we'd ever seen before.
Sabeti's team clicked into gear and began collecting discarded blood samples. If this virus was going to be combated, it had to be known. The samples were sent back to Sabeti's lab in Cambridge, and the genomes quickly sequenced. And then her team did something unexpected.
We immediately made them public to the World Wide Web. We needed to call attention to it. We needed every person to participate who could participate.
A global scientific effort to track Ebola led to a surprising discovery.
The virus was changing. It was mutating. They're picking up hundreds of mutations in a very short period of time. And so as the virus was having more opportunities to transmit from human to human than ever before, it was improving in its ability to do so.
As the virus was spreading, it was learning how to succeed and become more infectious. As it became more infectious, it spread further and spread out of control.
I can tell you sometimes the sorrow can be in it. Whenever I'm seeing my citizens dying on a daily basis, people are getting sick. They're dying, my brother. I must say,
healthcare workers began falling ill at an alarming rate, and droves of international organizations started leaving the region. But others ran into the fire.
My sense is that
Infectious disease expert Nahid Badilia decided to leave the comfort of her office at Boston University to join the fight against Ebola in Sierra Leone.
what most people don't realize, at least about the worst months of that outbreak, is that working in Ebola treatment units in West Africa then was like working in the middle of a war. And it was a war where the enemy's coming at you from every direction. We wear these heavy personal protective equipment, which make you sound like Darth Vader, so nobody can understand what you're saying. But also, your faces can't be seen by patients. So here you are in these astronaut suits. You're walking into these very crowded areas where patients are so scared. And, you know, yesterday their mom died, and today their youngest daughter died. And then tomorrow, I'm sure the dad will pass away. And you live that loss with them. Then you watch them slowly get worse and then die. And that itself would be enough. What made it worse was that in August 2014, there weren't enough resources on the ground.
All over West Africa, treatment centers were dangerously understaffed, and medical supplies were scarce. Healthcare workers had to improvise.
There just wasn't enough of anything. There wasn't enough chlorine. There wasn't enough protective gear for people. There weren't enough face masks. So initially, when we started to ask for help, we were basically asking for supplies.
In some cases, doctors were using sandwich bags to treat patients instead of plastic gloves.
I saw these disposable gloves hanging out to dry. And I turned to the lead clinician there and I said, you shouldn't be reusing those, they're disposable. And he said, yeah, we're dipping them in bleach, disinfecting them and reusing them because we have no other personal protective equipment. So what would you like us to do? Go in with no PPE or go in with disinfected latex gloves?
Doctors who followed all of the protocols, one mistake was all it took to become infected.
You felt this constant guilt because you were scared. You felt this constant guilt because you had to manage your own safety. Because it doesn't help anyone if another healthcare worker gets sick, so you have to balance your safety and the activities that you do in that Ebola treatment unit.
By now, so many people were getting ill, and there were only a limited amount of spaces in the Ebola treatment units, so people would call me. Our culture is largely, it's like a big man culture. You call the big man if you know a big man. And because I was in the president's office, I was, well, I guess, a big man. And people would call me thinking that I would use my influence and get them a space in the Ebola treatment unit. And there was a guy who called me because his sister had gotten sick. And he was crying on the phone and he called me, but there was really nothing I could do because there was absolutely no space. At this time, there were stories and you could see people lying outside the units and dying. And this haunted me because I knew if they took their sister back home, it meant the rest of the family would get sick. And that was the really, really bad thing about Ebola is that you end up giving Ebola to the people you love.
Mothers infected their daughters, sons their fathers. Whole families were wiped out. Desperate to stem the rising death toll, officials took a drastic step, one just as heartbreaking. They segregated the sick from the healthy. Families were torn apart.
You want to say you know well. You don't sick or your family then us you know well. Tell her let go hospital.
Many would never be reunited. 18-month-old Ibrahim tested positive for Ebola. Despite the separations, case counts skyrocketed. The 3 West African countries, already crippled by civil war and weak healthcare systems, struggled to keep up and pleaded for international support.
President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf spent a lot of the summer of 2014 raising the arms internationally, warning that her country simply wasn't prepared to respond to something like this.
There are dead bodies all over the place.
She asked for help again and again and again.
And we hope that we'll see the international community see this as a grave international disease and international catastrophe, and will respond to it in like kind.
And that's when a lot of American authorities started going over and trying to inspect what's actually happening on the ground, and they found a mess. They found a World Health Organization that simply hadn't done the required steps to get this virus under control.
And it was at that point that we started to really, the technical term would probably be freak out.
Case counts were doubling every month, yet global responders remained reluctant to act.
At one point, Doctors Without Borders tried to sound the alarm, tried to say, hey, this virus is getting really out of control in a really bad way. And the World Health Organization's response, delivered through the tweet of a spokesman, was to say, stop exaggerating.
And so if WHO does drop the ball, then that means the world is dropping the ball. And that's what we saw here.
Those who tried to pick up the ball found themselves in the impossible position of chasing after the virus.
We are not moving fast enough.
And never catching up.
The cat is most likely already out of the bag.
With the epidemic spinning out of control, the potential for a global pandemic was now more real than ever. But for that to occur, the virus would have to go through a giant incubator, a highly populated city with direct flights connecting it to the rest of the world. Like Lagos, Nigeria, one of the largest cities in Africa.
Lagos is a city of 25 million people, densely populated. You do not want an outbreak in Lagos because it's certainly going to spread to different countries. You come to the US, you go to the UK, you go to Spain, you go to Italy. And that was the fear.
A man who flew while sick from Liberia to Nigeria and was exposed, presumably to a lot of people.
Apparently didn't show symptoms until he was actually in the air sharing a cabin with dozens of other passengers.
In July 2014, a Liberian-American diplomat named Patrick Sawyer planned to attend a conference in Nigeria. He boarded a plane in Monrovia and flew to Lagos. By the time he landed, he had a high fever and was sent directly to the hospital. Dr. Adora Okoli had graduated from medical school just 3 weeks earlier.
I was called to the nurse's station and told that the patient wanted to see a doctor. So when I went to the patient's room, I found him on his bed with an IV bag on his bed. So on impulse, I picked up the bag and put it back on the IV stand.
Adora reported to her mentor, the head doctor, Amayo Adedevo.
So I told her, the patient is not getting better, he's getting worse, and his liver enzymes have just come out and they are markedly elevated. And I remember that in a program that I attended a month ago, that this was one of the things that Ebola would do.
Dr. Adedevo ordered an Ebola test. It came back positive.
Nigeria began this frantic effort to find every single person who had interacted with Mr. Sawyer, whether they sat next to him on the plane, sat next to him in the car, or any interaction at all with him.
I started feeling unwell about 4 days after the patient had passed on. So I called the helpline as soon as possible, and they sent an ambulance with someone to take my blood sample. So I went with him, and I was in the ambulance for about 4 hours, and nobody was saying anything to me. The door suddenly opened, and there was this Caucasian doctor who just, said to me, Dr. Ada, I'm sorry to inform you, but you tested positive. I was so scared.
Adora and a few of her colleagues were sent to isolation, in a treatment center outside Lagos.
I was feeling very sick. I had fever. I had no appetite whatsoever. I had sores all over my mouth. And, you know, people say they have joint aches and pains. I mean, break bone pain. And I remember my mother saying that I looked like I just come from the dead. I was in the ward one morning, and I had whispers that Dr. Adadova was in the ward. She was already really, really sick at the time that she was admitted. And it wasn't very long after her admission that she went into a coma, and unfortunately, she passed on. That was a shock. It was a rude shock. It was a blow to us because we didn't see it coming. We had lost an army general. We'd lost a hero. I'm only 28. I don't think that I've really done much with my life, that it's gonna end just like that.
After 14 grueling days, Adora's temperature returned to normal, and the doctors ran another blood test. It came back negative.
That was... it was a rebirth for me.
Adora walked out of the isolation ward, but 4 of her colleagues weren't so lucky.
It was a very devastating moment in my life, but a moment that also opened me up to the fact that adversity sometimes redirects and brings out purpose in people.
As Adora Okoli recovered, so did Nigeria. The country's relatively strong healthcare system made it less vulnerable to an all-out epidemic than its neighbors. The government acted swiftly. 3 months after the initial case, Nigeria was Ebola-free. But it raged on in West Africa. And then a new threat cropped up. This time, the whole world took notice.
Tonight, the first confirmed case here in America.
On September 19th, Thomas Eric Duncan left Liberia to join his fiancée in Dallas, Texas. His route took him through Brussels and Washington, D.C., before landing in Dallas. A few days later, he came down with a high fever and went to the ER at Texas Presbyterian. They sent him home with antibiotics.
Somewhere along the way, the hospital didn't ask all of the questions that they needed to ascertain that he had just come not only from a hot zone, but that he'd been in contact with somebody who had the Ebola virus.
2 days later, Duncan returned with more severe symptoms. Only then was he tested for Ebola. It came back positive.
I don't understand how they can't have thought about it when there's been an outbreak going on for a year and a half.
That one hospital probably had more than 40 doctors. The thing is, there are probably more doctors in that hospital than all of Liberia, right?
Public health officials are facing serious questions about their response to the crisis.
The highly qualified men and women of Texas Health Presbyterian are doing everything in their power to deliver the very best care for this patient.
CDC Emergency Operations Center, this line is...
The CDC dispatched a team on the ground to retrace Duncan's steps.
When Mr. Duncan went from the emergency room back to the apartment, who did he come into contact with? Was there incubating throughout Dallas?
Terror gripped the community. Parents started pulling children out of school.
Well, my understanding, you can get it just from touching something that somebody touches.
I just started crying. I was like hysterical.
People want to shake each other's hands. They want to talk to each other.
The school district has told parents that children are not in any imminent danger.
Why should we believe you when you're telling us this stuff?
On October 8th, Thomas Eric Duncan lost his fight against Ebola.
This is sad news. I want to reinforce to the public that this was an isolated incident.
But this was not an isolated incident.
Right now, Ebola emergency.
A healthcare worker in Dallas tests positive for the killer virus.
26-year-old Nina Pham was among about 70 staff members at a Dallas hospital who cared for Thomas Eric Duncan.
We wish this individual had not been infected, and we're concerned that there could be other infections in the coming days.
Her King Charles Spaniel being moved into quarantine at a decommissioned naval base.
This was the first time Ebola had been transmitted from one person to the next in the U.S. Nurse Pham was flown to one of the only hospitals ready to handle a case involving a lethally infective virus.
Nina Pham was sent to me here at the NIH to take care of with my team. The reason was that they were unclear what the heck was going on in Texas.
And then another nurse fell ill. The fear of an epidemic in America escalated.
A second healthcare worker is being treated for Ebola. A family member tells ABC News the woman's name is Amber Vinson.
The fact that the Ebola virus had actually spread from one patient to two nurses here in the United States set off an amount of paranoia about the medical system that is pretty much unprecedented in modern times.
And that's when the entire way we look at Ebola in this country changed.
There have been some headlines saying that all ISIS would need to do is send a few of its suicide killers into an Ebola-affected zone.
Should pets who have been exposed to the Ebola virus be euthanized? Yes. Or
you don't want us to panic. How about I don't want us to die?
The stark image of a sick American doctor sealed from head to toe.
Throughout the summer and fall of 2014, 8 Americans returned home infected with Ebola after serving on the front lines in West Africa.
Test results on the New York City doctor have come back
NBC
positive.
cameraman sick with Ebola.
They were transported to one of 4 hospitals around the country, now equipped to handle Ebola patients. Anxiety grew into a movement committed to keeping West Africans out and healthcare workers contained.
A fiery new debate. Is it fair to order mandatory quarantines for healthcare workers returning from the hot zone?
We have the legal authority to do it. We're doing it.
We were freaking out, in terms of us in the government, because it was like, if the American public turned against the response, it could affect our ability to get assistance from the U.S.
They were talking about quarantining health workers when they came back, which I argued firmly is the right word, against.
Because if every nurse and every doctor who comes back from the Ebola zone is going to be involuntarily quarantined for 21 days and not be able to go back to their old jobs, that's going to be a real problem.
If we make it harder to respond to the outbreak in West Africa, it will spread not only in those 3 countries, but to other parts of Africa, and will ultimately increase the risk here.
The tough task of informing the public on the science of Ebola fell to experts like Anthony Fauci.
If a person doesn't have any symptoms, they're not capable of transmitting it.
2 people have gotten infected with Ebola. 2. You will not get it if you don't have direct contact.
Why not? Just as a precaution till we get things under control, seal off the border.
And the only thing I can say is, what? Have you not been listening to what we've been saying?
Finally, some good news.
Our patient, Nina Pham, is free of Ebola.
Ultimately, all but one of the U.S. healthcare workers survived.
I'm so grateful to be well.
So did their dogs.
Bentley says thank you.
Experimental treatments may have given them the extra medical boost they needed to pull through. The recovery sent a signal. Ebola doesn't have to be a death sentence. That is, if you have the best health care in the world. It didn't seem possible that things could get worse in West Africa, but by September 2014, the outbreak had crossed the threshold into a cataclysmic disaster. Once it got a foothold in Liberia and Sierra Leone, it quickly migrated to the capital cities and exploded. As the body count rose, people lost trust in the government and aid workers. attempts to control the contagion with safe body removals fueled the distrust further.
There were so many bodies that the burial teams were overwhelmed. So then we had to cremate. But this is really, really weird for us because death is an event. And now you were going to burn the body and there was going to be no way to memorialize the person for the family.
It is impossible to change thousands of years of cultural traditions simply because somebody else told you to.
The epidemic had become the worst the world had seen, by thousands.
To put the size of this in perspective, the largest Ebola outbreak in history prior to 2014 was 425 cases. We had individual weeks during the West African outbreak where we saw more new cases than that entire outbreak.
Jeremy Kanundijk was the head of disaster relief at USAID. He was known for getting things done in the face of catastrophe.
Tom Frieden and I, who was the head of the CDC, traveled together out to Liberia. It was some of the darkest days of the Ebola outbreak in Liberia. It was certainly one of the scariest trips that I've ever taken. I had responded to hurricanes, earthquakes, war, famine, but I'd never seen anything quite like Ebola. And what made it worse was, in an earthquake, if you don't reach someone, it doesn't create 3 more victims of the earthquake. With Ebola, every person that we failed to reach risked making the disaster even larger than it already was. If you stuck a gun to my head in late August and said, "How are you going to do this?" I don't know that I could have told you.
When Jeremy Kanundijk and Tom Frieden returned from West Africa, they took the fight to the halls of power. The stakes couldn't have been higher.
This is something that none of us have ever done on this scale before.
I've never seen a public health situation with this much need for immediacy.
We were both shouting to the White House, shouting to the media, shouting to the humanitarian community, shouting to the medical community that this thing was not on track.
We have to stop it at the source in Africa.
And that getting it on track meant everyone would have to pitch in, including a lot of players who hadn't done this before. So it would mean bringing in the military, doctors from across Africa, logistics experts, behavioral experts, communications experts, data experts.
Many voices joined in, calling for more attention to the crisis, pressuring the powerful to act.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are seeing what we call a biosafety level 4 pathogen spreading unhindered in these countries.
The international response to the disease has been a failure.
It was going to take an outbreak operation, the likes of which the world had never seen before.
But here's the hard truth. In West Africa, Ebola is now an epidemic. It is getting worse, it's spreading faster and exponentially.
By mid-September, President Obama was convinced the American response needed a massive scaling up.
The Defense Department is continuing to deploy troops to provide command and control, engineering, training, and logistics support.
The U.S. Army was very conscious that they were going on a very different kind of deployment than they usually were. They weren't going to be carrying guns. The enemy they were fighting was not visible.
Medical, security, and financial responses to the crisis stepped up from all parts of the globe.
A group of British Army medics touched down in Freetown on Thursday in a bid to help Sierra Leone.
国政府近期向西非国家提供的第2批应对。
But despite the huge global influx of money, manpower, and materials, the case numbers accelerated at an astounding rate. Then, in January 2015, something started to change.
I think the response of the Chinese government, the US government, the British government, everybody who responded helped. But what really turned the tide was changing the behavior of people. There was a precipitous drop because if you weren't touching the sick people, then it was almost impossible for a person to get sick.
I think it's also really important as we understand how this played out that this was not something where the U.S. came in and just took over the whole show.
We are fighting back, and we will win.
The Ebola outbreak has ended in Sierra Leone, and we lost 3,589 of our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, our sons and daughters. May their souls rest in perfect peace.
In June of 2016, West Africa was finally declared Ebola-free. 28,616 infected, 11,310 dead. After Ebola, people emerged as if recovering from a long war.
There's a generation of West Africa that's just gone. And there are thousands of new orphans around West Africa.
And they're trying to rebuild back their lives literally from the scratch.
But as survivors mourned the loss of life, many hoped that something good might come of this tragedy.
You want all of their stories to be told, but at the very least, you want to make sure that they didn't die in vain and that this doesn't just happen again and again.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, health authorities say 55 people are feared to have died from Ebola.
2019, it's back. This time, the outbreak is spreading in the same country where it was first identified. Now Zaire is called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the drama playing out here is all too familiar. The epidemic is the second largest the world has known. But there's a slim ray of hope. Now there's a promising vaccine against Ebola Zaire. Health officials are deploying a ring strategy. Vaccinate all healthcare workers, close contacts of Ebola cases, and contacts of contacts to create a ring of immunity. But it's not easy to put into action or provide any medical care, because in this region, Ebola isn't the only enemy.
Just behind me is the Ebola treatment center here in Butembo, which is the epicenter of the epidemic. Just last week, this center was attacked and burned by rebel groups.
You have a community of people who are suspicious of the government, suspicious and scared of the armed groups. What you're trying to convince people to do is say, hey, leave your home and come into this tarp tent where you may or may not leave, but here's a guy with a gun who's following me around. Not a good look.
Right now, because of the security risks, more than half of the new infections that are coming in are not identified with any contact. That means that it's going to take a while to get this thing under control.
And that's time we don't have. Because if there's one thing we've learned from past outbreaks, it's that we have to move quickly to stay ahead of them.
But we're not super successful at it, right? And my concern now is that the Emergency Committee for WHO has looked at the situation in DRC twice now and has not declared it as a public health emergency of international concern. That has resulted in the political mobilization not ramping up the way it should.
I don't know how else you do this. How do you pay for a global public good? Who's responsible to pay for it?
We are at the NIH Clinical Center. I'm here to get vaccinated with the Ebola vaccine.
In the end, where governments and global agencies can't step up, the job falls to those whose passion keeps them in the trenches. Because for them, it's personal.
Any day now, a case of Ebola is going to cross the border from DRC into Uganda.
Nahid Bedelia is training nurses at a clinic on the border of these two nations. Her priority is simple.
We're not waiting for outbreaks to happen. We are building capacity so when outbreaks happen, we're there, we're ready. I know that I'm going back soon, you know, and I will probably go back again and again until I feel like I have gotten this out of my system.
Adora Okoli fought for her life and against all odds, survived. That was before she knew she would have another life to protect.
When I found out I was pregnant, is there likely to be Ebola in my placenta? You know, is it able to somehow get into my fetus? The baby was tested, and thankfully, there was no Ebola in those samples. That's a body of knowledge that's been added to what we know right now.
Now with a master's in public health, Adora plans to return to Nigeria to continue the fight against health inequality.
Knowledge is power, knowledge is key. Doesn't matter how long the life is, even if I die in the next 10 years, it's what have I done with the life that I have.
For Adora, surviving Ebola means fighting for those who are most vulnerable. Thanks to others like her, Ibrahim survived too.
All yours.
I got to tell you thank you for the efforts you make. Because it make you see me cry. I'm small boy that was called bear we be say big part this. You know, you will survive, you die.
15 years.
This now we. But this now we know which the stage and it. About 1 year, 6 months. You will survive. Yeah.
Your boy is very, very special, huh? He's a fighter, he's very strong. And you cannot imagine how happy we are.
Every virus tells a story. We still don't know how this one ends. Only that we're the ones who will write it.